Hi everyone. In this video, we will see how to download and run a second copy of Android Studio using the zip archive distribution while keeping your existing Android Studio installation intact. This allows you to test or use any other version of Android Studio side by side with your main installation without uninstalling or altering your current setup. According to the official documentation, you don't need to replace your stable Android Studio to try a new version. You can install another version, like a preview build, side by side with the stable version, and even work on the same projects in both. Android Studio makes this possible by storing settings for each installation in a separate folder specific to that version. Moreover, all installations will share the same Android SDK location by default, so you won't need to duplicate or re-download the SDK for each version. So, why run multiple versions of Android Studio? There are several reasons you might want to run a second version of Android Studio in parallel with your primary installation. Firstly, try preview beta features. You may want early access to new features available in a canary or beta release of Android Studio without disturbing your stable development environment. Using a zip installation of the preview version lets you experiment freely while your main, stable Android Studio remains unchanged. Secondly, maintaining legacy projects. If you work on older projects that require an earlier Android Studio version or have compatibility issues with the latest version, running that older version side by side is helpful. This way, you can open the legacy project in the required Android Studio release and use the latest version for new projects on the same machine. Thirdly, no risk to the main setup. The secondary Android Studio will not interfere with your primary installation. Each version keeps its settings isolated in a version-specific directory. This separation means you can configure plugins and settings differently per version if needed. Fourthly, shared SDK and resources. All installed versions can use the same Android SDK and emulator setup to save disk space and avoid redundancy. Any SDK updates you download via one installation will be available to the others since they default to using the common SDK directory. Okay, now we will download the Android Studio zip file. Go to the official Android Studio download page on the Android developers website. And locate the version you want to install as a zip package. For Windows, there is typically a .zip download option available in addition to the .exe installer. For example, if you want a preview or a specific older version, you can find it on the site under Android Studio Downloads or the Preview section. Click the appropriate zip download for your desired version and save it to your computer. For example, here I will choose the Android Studio Ladybug zip file to download. Once the download finishes, locate the zip file. Extract the contents of the zip archive. This will unpack an Android Studio folder containing all the files for that Android Studio version, the IDE executables, libraries, etc. Ensure that the folder is fully unzipped. You should see subfolders like bin, lib, and so on after extraction. Next, we launch the new Android Studio executable. Navigate to the bin subdirectory. Here, you'll find the launch executables for Android Studio. On a 64-bit Windows system, double-click studio64.exe to start this version of Android Studio. On a 32-bit system, use studio.exe. The Android Studio splash screen should appear, indicating that the IDE is starting up. Because this is the first run of this version on your machine, Android Studio may prompt you with a setup wizard. For example, it might ask if you want to import settings from your existing Android Studio. You can choose Do Not Import Settings to start fresh, or import from your older version. Either choice is fine, as it will not affect your other installation. The settings are stored separately, so importing just copies settings. Not importing will create new default settings for this version. Next, if this zip version is a newer or different release, it might also ask you to confirm the Android SDK path. Remember that the zip package does not include the Android SDK tools by itself. Since you already have the SDK from your main installation, simply point the new Android Studio to the existing SDK directory on your computer when prompted. Usually, the wizard will auto-detect the SDK location if the stable version was installed. By default, all Android Studio installations share the same SDK location. After this initial setup, the new Android Studio will finish launching. You are now running a second instance of Android Studio with its own settings and preferences. Now that the setup is done, you can test and use both installations in parallel. Open your existing Android Studio, installed via .exe, and the new Android Studio from the zip independently. For instance, you can open a project in the stable version and the same or another project in the new version to compare behaviors. Keep in mind that if the second version is a preview or newer release, it may upgrade some project files, like Gradle or code style settings, when you open a project. This could make those project files incompatible with the older version of Android Studio. To avoid any issues, you might want to use separate copies of the project for testing, or only open projects in the newer IDE that you don't need to go back to the older IDE. Aside from that, there is no harm in running both IDEs. They operate independently. You can even run them at the same time if your computer has enough resources, since they are just two separate programs. Okay, all right, guys, we have seen how to download and run a second copy of Android Studio using the zip archive distribution on Windows. See you guys in the next lecture.